Born in Louisville, Kentucky, or is it Louisville? Which is it? Louisville? I was always told it's like one long syllable. Okay, so. Born in Louisville, Kentucky on January the 17th, 1942, he faced multiple challenges as an African-American boy growing up during decades of racial conflict and political unrest. Add to that his decision to avoid being drafted into the U.S. Army, as well as his decision to embrace the Islamic religion, made this person a very divisive figure in very many circles. But one thing that few would argue was how good he was at what he did for a living. He truly was one of the best. He combined this incredible natural ability that God gave to him along with this work ethic that very few people could have to make him known around the world as the greatest. On top of having to fight those racial and religious biases, though, one of the things that people just either loved or hated about this man was his arrogance. He didn't hesitate to tell people how good he was. In fact, he said this, "I am the greatest." And I said that even before I knew I was. It caused many people to want to see him fall or fail more than ever, but he just kept on winning. Who am I talking about? Muhammad Ali. Now, you can dislike him for his arrogance, but if you watched him fight during his prime years, he was an amazing boxer. He truly could, I think, float like a butterfly and sting like a bee, and like he said, you can't hit what you can't see. He was amazing. But I remember growing up feeling just a little uncomfortable with his arrogance and with his boasting. Now today, if you're plugged into the sports scene at all, you know that there's all kinds of discussions going on about who's the GOAT. Now, for those of you who don't know, GOAT is not a four-legged creature that I'm talking about right now, okay? GOAT stands for the greatest of all time, okay? It's an acronym. And in golf, most people would say it's either Jack Nicklaus or Tiger Woods. In hockey, many people would point to Wayne Gretzky. In basketball, depending on where you live and when you really watched basketball, I'm assuming most of us in this part of the country would say that Michael Jordan is the GOAT of basketball. In football, oh man, as much as I hate to admit it, I really think the GOAT is Tom Brady, okay? I think he's pretty awesome. All of these people have won multiple championships and personally have achieved things that no one before them have ever achieved. And it's their records now that other people in all of these sports are trying to achieve. Now, most of the GOATs that I just mentioned in this second slide didn't come across near as arrogant as Muhammad Ali. But they all had and sometimes exercised their right to boast about just how good they were. They just didn't flaunt it, maybe like other people have. Now today, as we continue our study through 2 Corinthians, we're going to hear the Apostle Paul use the word boast a number of times. And I've got to say this. When you preach a series of messages through a particular book, you run into some stuff that you don't normally preach about, okay? I can honestly say in 30-some years of ministry, I don't think I've ever preached a sermon on boasting, okay? But it's the topic, okay? And if I'm going to do an expository series out of 2 Corinthians, I think I have to talk today about the topic of a Christian and boasting. So let's make sure we understand what the word boast means, okay? It means to brag about something or to rejoice in or find glory in something. Being boastful is not something that Christians generally do, at least in public. In our minds, we might find satisfaction in something that we've done, but we really don't boast about it. Because we might sound prideful if we do that, and we all know what follows pride, don't we? a fall. But the Apostle Paul was willing to boast about certain things. In fact, let's jump to chapter 11, okay? Our main focus is going to be on chapter 10 today, but I want you to jump to chapter 11 with me and just consider these words of Paul out of the ESV, okay? 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 16. I repeat, let no one think me foolish, but even if you do, accept me as a fool so that I too may boast a little. What I am saying with this boastful confidence, I say not as the Lord would, but as a fool. Since I'm boasting according to the flesh, I too will boast. Here's the dilemma. Paul was willing to boast about certain things in his life. So the question becomes for us, what are those things? And how did they help his ministry or his cause for Christ? My hope today is that we'll be able to answer both of those questions before we leave, and that I'm going to challenge you to perhaps include a little boasting about your lives, especially about those things that can actually bring fruit or help extend the ministry of Christ and the kingdom of Jesus here on this earth. After calling a timeout in chapters 8 and 9, and that's how I look at it, Paul called a timeout to talk about generous giving and generosity in a Christian's life. In chapter 10, he drops back into his defensive posture again, defending his work, his ministry, against his critics who had come into Corinth. What he's doing in chapter 10 is he's trying his best to reconnect those from the church who have left his teaching and gone into the teaching or followed the teaching of those critics and those who opposed him after he left. Well, it seems like most of the congregation in Corinth, based on what we read, kept following Paul. There were some. There was a group who said, you know what, we're going to go with this faction. We're going to go with these teachers. And so Paul's goal here is to make sure that they understand that they are his spiritual children. He's the one who told them about the Word of God and told them about what Jesus did for them on the cross. He was so upset about what was happening in Corinth with this group of people who were leaving his teachings and following these other people that he said, I will go to war. I will use warfare to be able to win you back. Look at these words in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 3. He says, though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war again according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. The strongholds here that I think he's talking about are the tactics that his critics were using to try to sway people away from him and to follow their teachings. Paul's saying here, I will fight for you because you are my children. And I'm much more concerned about truth than I am anyone's perception about me. Ever heard the phrase, perception is reality? Are you familiar with that phrase? If you research it, those words are first credited to a man by the name of Lee Atwater back in 1988. Atwater served on the campaign team for George H.W. Bush, who at the time was running for the office of President of the United States against Michael Dukakis. If you were alive during those years and paying any attention, you can remember how hard the Bush campaign worked to portray Dukakis like they wanted him to be seen. Their goal was to put ideas into people's minds about who he was. Even if they weren't true, they wanted you to believe that they were true. For me, the most vivid image is Michael Dukakis driving an army tank. You remember that picture? Now, what are the odds of an American president ever driving a tank? But they wanted you to think that that's what his focus was. They wanted our perception of him to become that reality. And you know what? It worked. Because Bush was far behind in the polls just a few weeks before the election. And yet he defeated him because they were able to our perceptions become reality. So many times in our world today, people still think that perception is reality. Because they think it's true, it's true. I guess if you think about it, that makes sense, does it not? As we're moving in this postmodern context, in this postmodern movement in our world, where we're trying to get away from absolute truth, and it's coming to the point where anybody can believe what they want, and that becomes truth, it makes sense. Things don't have to be true for everyone anymore. They just have to be true for us. But sometimes, you know what? Our perception may be accurate, but our perspective is not complete. Take a look at this picture, okay? Each person in this picture is correct in their perception. To the one on the left, it truly is the number 6, is it not? And to the one on the right, it is the number 9. Each of them are right, at least from where they're standing. But their perception doesn't allow them to see the whole picture. I ran across an article by Dr. Jim Taylor. That's not James Taylor, the singer, okay? It's a doctor, who had an article in Psychology Today back in 2019 entitled "Perception is Not Reality." Talks about how the two are not the same, but yet so many people easily buy into the idea that they are. Let me just share this quote with you from the article from Taylor. He says this: "Perception and reality have very different meanings. The former, that being perception, occurs entirely in the mind, in which mental gymnastics can turn any belief into reality." I love that phrase. The mental gymnastics. But then he says the other, that being reality, exists completely outside of the mind and can't be easily manipulated. As you can tell just from the title of the article, Taylor doesn't buy into the idea that just because we believe something that it's true. He goes on to share in the article about how there has to be other factors to determine what reality really is. And in my mind, as I look at chapter 10, what Paul is doing here is he's pointing out that the perception of his critics and his adversaries is not reality. And it's not complete by any stretch of the imagination because they're not seeing the bigger picture. The perception was simply this, that Paul would write strong letters, but in person, he was a wimp. He was very weak, they said. And so Paul begins addressing this in the very beginning of chapter 10 in verse 1. New Living Translation says it this way. He says this: "Now I, Paul, appeal to you with the gentleness and kindness of Christ. Though I realize you think I am timid in person and bold only when I write from far away." Why would the Corinthians ever think that? Well, jump down to what he says in verses 9 and 10 in chapter 10. ESV says it this way. He goes, I don't want to appear to be frightening you in my letters, for that's Paul's critics, okay? That's the people who've come into town. For they say his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech of no account. See, the perception of Paul was that he lacked the guts to stand face to face with them and tell the Corinthians what he really wanted them to do. Instead, what they're suggesting is this: he would put his thoughts on paper, and then he would send it to them through a messenger while he was miles away. Know somebody like that? Ever work for a boss like that? Man, the memos and the letters and all that communication is so critical and so judgmental and telling you everything that you're doing wrong. But when they come to see you in person, hey, you're doing a great job. Glad to see you. Ever had a boss like that? Man, if you have, it's frustrating, isn't it? And you see that person as being, what, strong? No, you see them as being very weak. Well, Paul doesn't hesitate to address this false perception because in verse 11 he says this, let such a person understand that what we say by letter when absent, we do when present. What that means is back in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, when Paul looked them in the eyes, Paul wrote about them tolerating sexual sin inside the church and actually being proud of it. He probably looked them in the eyes when he was standing with them in Corinth and saying, deal with this. And if he hadn't done it yet, he was more than willing to do it later. And back in 1 Corinthians, because again, 1 Corinthians is all we have left to really talk about how he could be firm. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, he's saying, hey, all these divisions that are taking place in the church, stop it. And my guess is when he was there with them in person, he would look at them and say, hey, stop it. But you know, some of the most... I read 1 Corinthians again, and some of the most direct and almost threatening words that he wrote are, I think, found in chapter 16, verse 22, where he says this, if anyone does not love the Lord, that person is cursed. Oh, Lord, come. Do you think he had the guts to say that to them in person? I do. I don't think he was just writing things that he wouldn't say. So one of the things that he's doing here in chapter 10 is he's saying that their perception about him is not reality. He was more than willing to write and to speak the same thing that God had told him to say. And the reason for that was what? His connection to Christ. He had a connection that these other people did not possess. It allowed him to write whatever he felt led to write and to treat people the way that he thought that they should be treated face to face. Jump back up to verse 7 in chapter 10. And I think he gives reasons for boasting when he says this. Look at what is before your eyes. If anyone is confident that he is Christ's, let him remind himself that just as he is Christ's, so also are we. For even if I boast a little too much of our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up and not for destroying you, I will not be ashamed. Paul just wanted them to know the truth. And their perception may have been that he was too weak in person, but he had the grounds to do whatever he wanted to do, because you see, Jesus himself, remember Acts chapter 9? Jesus himself had given Paul the ministry that he had. His critics couldn't say that. They could say that they were followers of Christ, and they probably were. But none of them could look anyone in the eye and say, Jesus told me personally to teach you this. See, that's the authority that Paul had that they didn't. And Paul's saying, you know what? I will boast about that authority. Let me just pause here for a second and suggest a lesson that I think we can learn from this chapter today. I've tried to give a simple lesson out of each chapter. Here's the one for today. It's okay to boast about God's reality in your life. It's okay to boast about God's reality in your life. Now, I know some who are listening will never be comfortable boasting or bragging about anything. But can we agree that Paul is boasting in these passages? And if our thought is, you know what? Paul said, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Why do we pick and choose what we imitate in Paul and what we don't? If Paul says, imitate me, and he's willing to boast about certain things, then should we not at least consider that as being a part of our life as well? I think the thing we have to be careful of is that we make sure that we're only boasting about the things that God has given us or has helped us to do, because that's what Paul did. In a nutshell, when we boast about God's working in our life, who are we really boasting about? We're boasting about God. And we're boasting about what he's doing in our lives. So I hope we can all agree on the fact that it's okay to boast about God. Okay, I hope we can get to that point. Because that appears to be exactly what Paul is doing in 2 Corinthians. So when was the last time you bragged to someone about something that God did in your life? Think about it. When was the last time you bragged about something that God did in your life? It's probably been a while for most of us, but if you think about it, helping others hear the reality of what God is doing in our lives just may correct some of their misperceptions about God. Could it be that the world has the wrong perception about God because Christians have been silent about what God's been doing in our lives? So today I want to give you a license to brag about God's involvement in your life. People need to hear those things. Don't be obnoxious about it. We've had those experiences in our lives. Don't be obnoxious about it, but put it in a way when appropriate, it helps people see God for who he really is. We're helping them see reality and not some misperception. So when doing this, I think the rest of the chapter gives us a couple of wise principles that we can turn to make sure that we stay in the right lanes when we do boast or brag about what God's doing in our life. And the first piece of wisdom that I want to share with you today is this. Our boasting doesn't come from comparing ourselves to others. Because here's the bottom line there. No matter what we do, there's always going to be somebody, what? Better than us. And there's also going to be people who aren't as good as us. I don't care what we do. There's always going to be people who are going to be better than us and those who just aren't quite as good. And Paul's wisdom is to not look at those people and compare ourselves to them, and that's what we boast about. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. Now that we dare to, not that we dare to classify or compare ourselves with some of those who are commending themselves, boasting, but when they measure themselves by one another and compare themselves with one another, they're without understanding. You know, the lack of understanding seems to be that people just can't see the big picture. People think they're the goat, but fail to acknowledge that, you know what, others have done the work, and they're just taking credit for it. It seems to me, and my experiences have been when people do that, that's just plain arrogance. That's not what Paul's being here. So if you're going to boast about what God is doing in your life, be careful that you don't measure it against what God may be doing in someone else's life, because you know what? He's still working in their life too. I think that's true for churches too. So many times we want to compare ourselves to what God is doing in another church. And if maybe they're not growing and they're not having the success that we are, then we'll say, hey, look what God's doing to us, better than compared to that church. Guess what? There's always going to be a church that God blesses in a different way that does other things that will make our church look lesser. So don't compare ourselves, okay, whenever we boast. The next principle is simply this. When you boast, stay within the areas of influence that God has given to you. We'll unpack that for a second. Let me just say it again. When you boast, stay within the areas of influence that God has given to you. You see, Paul knew exactly what God wanted him to do. His mission was to take Christ's message to the non-Jewish people. His mission wasn't to establish strong leadership and structure within the Jerusalem church and the surrounding areas. That was James's job. It wasn't Paul's job to have a relationship with Jesus and write his life that emphasizes the personal nature and to then capture this vision of what the end of time will look like, because that was John's job. Paul understood exactly the things that God wanted him to do, and so he looked for what God was doing in those areas. And when he saw things, he was more than willing to boast about them because he felt that was God's commendation to him. Look with me at pretty much the rest of chapter 10, beginning in verse 13. Paul says, "But we will not boast beyond limits, but we will boast only within regard to the area of influence God assigned to us, to reach even to you. For we are not overextending ourselves as though we did not reach you, for we were the first to come all the way to you with the gospel of Christ. We do not boast beyond limit in the labors of others, for our hope is that as our faith increases, or as your faith increases, our area of influence among you may be greatly enlarged, so that we may preach the gospel in lands beyond you without boasting of work already done in another man's area of influence." Verse 17, "Let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. For it is not the one who commends himself who is approved, but the one whom the Lord commends." Here's the thing. Paul knew that he was sent by God to start this church in Corinth. He knew he was the one who shared the first gospel message with them. He knew he was their spiritual father. He knew what he'd been sent to do, and he was doing exactly that. And that's when he was willing to boast. His thoughts were this: if God continues in this area and I talk about those things, then it might expand my areas of influence. Think missionary. How many times have you heard a missionary come before a church or come before a group and share, quote, boast about what God has done through them in their area? Oh, we've had this many people come to Christ, this many baptisms, we've had this, we've started this, we've done that. And the list goes on. They're bragging. They're boasting. But only about what God has done through them. Paul's primary objective was for himself to be commended by God for what he had done. So let me just ask you a couple questions. What is it in your life that God led you to do and helped you accomplish? And why would you not boast about those things? In some faith circles, they call this giving your testimony. Now, we think about giving your testimony as just talking about how you came to Christ and that kind of stuff. But you know what? There are some churches where they continually talk about what God is doing in their lives. They're bragging. They're boasting. They're saying things that most people may not feel comfortable saying. How impactful, though, has it been for you to hear certain people tell their testimony or to brag? Man, I can think there have been some in my life that have just blown me away. And there's been others that I've just been totally bored with because all they can do is talk about themselves. But man, when they're talking about what God's doing through them, it's absolutely amazing. I think we can tell the difference. And so what I'm encouraging you to do today is to talk about your accomplishments that God has done through you. Now, I'm convinced it's the reality that people need to hear so that their perception of God can be adjusted. Because most people don't have an accurate reality of God. They just have these misperceptions. Here's the thing. If we don't feel like God's doing anything in our lives, then maybe we have to ask ourselves, have we stepped outside the areas of influence that he wants us to be working in? Because you see this, God is willing to bless any effort that he has called us to do and given us the mission or the task to do. So if we've lost sight of what those things are, what is it that God has put within our limits and what's the guardrails in our lives that God says, I want you to work inside these. And you know what? If we're outside those, then it's our perception of God's reality that needs to be adjusted. And we're the ones who need to realign what we think is true with what God wants us to do here on earth. My goal today is to incite you into being a group of boastful people. Not prideful and arrogant that people don't want to listen to. But we need to talk about what God's doing in our lives. And you know what? If you have some problems with this whole idea of being boastful, maybe you need to change your perception a little bit about what's Paul's reality concerning this word. Because he does it. And we're told to imitate him as we imitate Christ. Most of us here will never be the GOAT of anything. Most of us will never be the greatest of all time at anything we do. But you know what? God is the greatest of all time. And oh, do we need to tell people what he's doing in our lives so they will know reality.